Happy Friday. Welcome to episode 10 of Be a Voice. We're in double digits. That's exciting. We made it to the end of the week. Impeachment happened. The world didn't end. And Christmas is almost here. Life is good. Life is good this week. So there's a lot I want to cover today. I'll touch on impeachment. I want to talk about an article that just came out about Trump in Christianity Today. And then I want to spend a good portion talking about Virginia and their new gun control legislation. So I just want to get right into it. Impeachment. I've spent a good amount of time trying to avoid talking in length about this subject because this entire thing was like sitting through a terribly scripted movie with the world's most boring plot, and you already know the ending. But, you know, we all have to do things in life that we don't want to do, so here we go. The impeachment vote was held on Wednesday, and we got to hear from more congressmen and women on how they were saving democracy and our country by voting to impeach the president. And then you had the other extreme side of the argument, and we had some Republicans standing up and declaring that the treatment of the president and this process was the equivalent to Pearl Harbor and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And that is a hard no for both of those. But a majority of Republicans that spoke did bring up good points and highlight that this whole thing was just beyond partisan. That the fact that not a single crime was charged in the articles of impeachment, and that Democrats were calling for impeachment the day of Trump's inauguration. And as if it wasn't clear enough that the process was driven by this partisan animus, it was further proven in the House vote. So both articles of impeachment passed without a single Republican vote, and we saw 2 Democrats vote against both articles. So impeachment was passed without a hint of bipartisan support. In fact, if you want to be technical, the only shred of a bipartisan effort was the vote against impeachment, with those 2 Democrats voting against their party. Again, the whole thing was a political stunt that will go nowhere in the Senate and will be forgotten about in a month. And that is if Nancy Pelosi actually decides to convey the articles of impeachment to the Senate, because right now she's sitting on them until Senate Republicans agree to go about the proceedings the way she wants, because we're now back in 5th grade. The Democrats are so confident in their articles of impeachment and on the basis of their case that they're threatening Mitch McConnell to submit to their demands or they won't pass over impeachment. This is all so ridiculous. This will eventually be over again. And at the end of the day, it didn't do anything to Trump's reelection effort except slightly raise his current approval ratings. However, that's not what should concern us. The lasting impact of this impeachment process has major consequences. This impeachment vote sets a dangerous precedent. The standard is now, if you don't like a president, you don't even need legal grounds or standards to attempt to remove him from office. The only thing in the way is which party holds control of the House and Senate. That's your only obstacle. I'm not even saying Trump didn't do anything wrong or illegal. The fact is, we don't know. I don't know. You don't know. Because we haven't received any evidence. The House was in charge of investigating and failed miserably, but they moved forward without a criminal standard anyway. And if we were to apply that same standard presented by both articles of impeachment to former President Barack Obama, he would have gotten impeached countless times. Let's name a few. Operation Fast and Furious, Obama's IRS illegally targeting conservative 401c3 and C4s. He started an illegal war in Libya without congressional approval. He droned American citizens overseas. He was caught on a hot mic telling Dmitry Medvedev that if he'll have more flexibility once he was reelected if Russia would back off until then. He made backdoor deals in the Iran deal, attempting to give this terrorist sponsoring state access to U.S. banks. It only got stopped when banks said, no. He lied and tried to cover up Benghazi And how about the constant unconstitutional overreaching, like the illegal expansion of IRS power without congressional approval? Illegal recess appointments, EPA cap and trade, net neutrality, DACA. He delayed the Obamacare employer mandate. I could go on, but I'm pretty sure you get the picture. The point is, and I will keep saying this until the day I die, but the world did not start spinning the day Trump was elected. Presidents and politicians have constantly broken laws and overreached, and I'm not defending it. I'm just being realistic about the state of our politics. It was messy before Trump, and Trump was merely a response to that mess. The Democrats, again, couldn't even come up with an actual criminal charge or the prerequisite intent needed to back up their primary claim of bribery. A charge they couldn't even establish as an article of impeachment because the Democrats themselves knew they had no evidence. If this is our new standard, God help us. And this leads into sort of where Christians think about Trump. And when it comes to Christianity, we always hear, how could you possibly support Trump if you're a Christian? And you can say the same thing about Democrats. This whole impeachment process only confirms your already view of Trump. So yesterday, in a somewhat surprising fashion to me personally, Christianity Today, probably the most well-known evangelical magazine, came out with an article entitled, "Trump Should Be Removed from Office." And this was written by, I think he's retiring, but the editor, Mark Galli. Hope I'm saying his last name right. So the piece opens up by arguing why this all needed to be said, why he's writing this article, and that Christianity Today can't stay quiet anymore about Trump amidst this whole impeachment thing. So the article argues, and I quote, "The facts in this instance are unambiguous. The President of the United States attempted to use his political power to coerce a foreign leader to harass and discredit one of the president's political opponents. That is not only a violation of the Constitution, more importantly, it is profoundly immoral." Okay, first of all, nothing about this instance was unambiguous, which is why, for the 1 millionth time, the Democrats couldn't even come up with a basis for an actual criminal charge. If it was so explicit, you would have evidence of criminal charges and attach those charges to the articles of impeachment and have bipartisan support. This is right off the bat very overly editorialized and inaccurate. Second, where was the coercion? Saying, "Can you do us a favor?" to Zelensky on a phone call, and then Ukraine proceeding to not have Biden investigated, and then the U.S. giving the aid anyway, is hardly pressure. That's like when you're in college and you're at a party and you don't want to drink, but one of your friends comes up to you and says, "Hey, have a drink." And you say, "No, I'm good, thanks." And your friend just kind of shrugs and says, "Okay," and walks away. That's what happened. But I guess that's coercion. Also, he mentions that this is harassing and discrediting Biden. Inquiring about an investigation into someone on the premise of possible corruption is not harassment. That's called due diligence. That's called doing your duty as a leader. But this whole piece was very hyperbolic and just really dignified. But Mark continues, "The reason many are not shocked about this is that this president has dumbed down the idea of morality in his administration. And as evidence of this, the author explains that Trump has now convicted criminals that once worked for his administration. And I'm sure he's talking about mostly the minor tax fraud charges found in the Mueller investigation. And he also mentions that his immoral actions with women in the past. And he really goes off about his Twitter feed and calls it a string of mischaracterizations, lies, and slanders. Again, this is a perfect example of someone believing the world started spinning with Trump. Spoiler alert, immoral men have sat in the Oval Office many times before our current president. I just got done listing a few unconstitutional and immoral actions from our last president. The difference is now we have a president whose life is an open book. He doesn't hide anything, and his obsession with social media makes him that much more transparent. The entire article really was a condemnation of Trump's indecent behavior rather than a substantiated and evidentiary legal reason for why he should be removed. The author clearly focuses on Trump as a person and uses the whole pressured a foreign government for personal gain argument to justify his righteous indignation. Trump is no more immoral than the lowest standard already set by centuries of men holding the highest office of the land. For instance, the beloved John F. Kennedy. He tainted the office with his laundry list of condemnable, oh my gosh, why can't I speak today? Actions, including routinely engaging in affairs with women other than his wife, including high-class prostitutes, going so far as hosting them in the White House. He also used White House aides as drug mules and made a habit of using his Secret Service as watchdogs to protect the secrecy of his objectively immoral rendezvous. Lyndon B. Johnson openly bragged about having sex with more women than JFK and was known to be a serial flasher. Woodrow Wilson, our nation's infamous fascist president, advocated for a homogenous Caucasian population. And let's not forget dear old Bill. The piece does mention that they published an article back in '98 condemning Clinton for his actions, but at least Clinton was charged with actual crimes in his impeachment proceedings. Regardless, I could make an entire episode on the entire list of immoral behavior from past presidents. To pretend that Trump is unique in this respect is either just ignorant or being deliberately dishonest. So Galley begins his conclusion with this. To the many evangelicals who continue to support Mr. Trump in spite of his blackened moral record, we might say this. Remember who you are and whom you serve. Consider how your justification of Mr. Trump influences your witness to your Lord and Savior. Consider what an unbelieving world will say if you continue to brush off Mr. Trump's immoral words and behavior in the cause of political expediency. Do you know what politics is? It's literally brushing off words and behavior we don't like in the cause of political expediency. Seriously. That's the ugly nature of politics, and it has been since the birth of our constitutional republic. We vote for the person that we trust the most to pass policy that most closely aligns with our values and beliefs. So we analyze the cost and the benefits. And yes, as Christians, we are willing to trade in less than appealing rhetoric for religious liberty and pro-life policy. Because what is our alternative? Fake inclusion at the expense of unborn children? A false sense of unity along with the immoral socialistic policy? That's supposed to be better? Apparently, Democratic candidates calling for the distribution of private property by force, abortion on demand, and advocating that men can be women and women can be men is less morally troubling than Trump's tweets. Politics is not religion. Politics comes with compromise and trade-offs. Religion doesn't. If we voted purely on morality, no one would be in office because there would be no one we could vote for. Do I wish our politicians had moral decency and spotless integrity? Of course. But the fact is, public officials have never been our moral leaders. And to be honest, I'm extremely disappointed. This was audaciously written, extremely exaggerated, and the nature of it sort of came off as a partisan hit piece than anything remotely rooted in non-biased logic. Okay, those are my thoughts. I want to move on and talk about guns because I love guns. Well, I'm a huge Second Amendment supporter, and gun control is definitely a topic I could go on all day on. But I want to preface this with the fact that I have been around in shotguns ever since I was young. I respect firearms, and I view them as tools to defending liberty per our unalienable rights. And this is how law-abiding gun owners view firearms. We don't abuse them. We aren't careless. We take the responsibility of our Second Amendment liberty very seriously. Yet when it comes to gun control, we are the ones punished for the unforgivable crimes of the evil with no hint of respect for the law or human life. And gun control is unconstitutionally stripping the rights of the decent while giving an upper hand to the corrupt. So, what we have in the news, good old Democratic-run Virginia, now entirely Democratic-run. Virginia is attempting to enact this authoritarian and wildly unconstitutional laws entirely based on the false premise that gun control works. So Governor Ralph Northam, the man who advocates for killing babies outside of the womb and who likes to wear blackface, is leading the charge of a pending assault weapons ban. Northam is also toying with the idea of a grandfather clause provision, but it would include all current owners of the now prohibited firearms to register with the government. So, right now, Senate Bill 16, which is introduced by Senator Richard Saslaw, does not include a grandfather clause. And in order to make an assault weapons ban, you actually have to define what an assault weapon is. This term drives me nuts. Made up term that does not and has never had a clear definition. But obviously, when you're writing legislation, you need to write down what qualifies as an assault weapon. And for Virginia, that includes, and this is coming right from the bill, a semi-automatic centerfire rifle with a fixed magazine with a capacity greater than 10 rounds, which is insane. That's every gun I own. A semi-automatic centerfire rifle with a detachable magazine that has basically any aesthetic modification, such as a pistol grip. It's literally just a different grip. A shotgun with a revolving cylinder, a semi-automatic shotgun with an added characteristic such as a folding stock. That's the same thing as the modification as a pistol grip, which I always find hilarious because when they list these aesthetic modifications they have absolutely no effect on the firing power. My AR has a second-hand grip. It fires exactly the same when it didn't have a second-hand grip. So in other words, Senate Bill 16 would create a total ban on all commonly owned semi-automatic firearms. And if you are convicted of importing, selling, transferring, manufacturing, purchasing, possessing, or transporting an assault weapon, it is considered a Class 6 felony and punishable by up to 5 years in prison. And in response to this, thank God we have some backlash. Over 50 counties in Virginia have declared themselves Second Amendment sanctuaries, which they should. If illegal aliens can have sanctuary cities, so can law-abiding gun owners. At least the latter is an actual right. Democrats, of course, were not at all pleased about the backlash, with even one representative, Donald McEachin, suggesting that the governor, quote, may have to nationalize the National Guard to enforce the law. So gun owners are prospectively refusing to register their guns to the same people who want to confiscate them. You cannot blame them. And in response, an elected official threatens the use of the state military. What on God's green earth is this tyrannical nonsense? And what is driving this type of regulatory insanity? Again, it's the false belief that gun control works. The fact is, there is not a shred of evidence indicating that more gun control equals less gun violence. And back in June, I wrote a rebuttal article to another piece that was published on ThoughtCo titled The Top 3 Arguments for Gun Control. And this article was written by Jill Silas Rooney, and she is an assistant professor who has her PhD in history. So I thought I would go over this because I think it sets a good background of gun control and its ineffectiveness. So the first argument presented in the article was that gun control saves lives, and to prove this, the author cited the Australia example. the anti-gun crowd loves to mention Australia. And I love it when they do because I love debunking it. So there was a large drop in the gun homicide rate in Australia after the government implemented the 1996 National Agreement on Firearms, which was one of the world's largest mandatory gun buybacks, aka confiscations. You cannot buy back something that was never yours in the first place. Even Obama cited Australia's buyback program as an example to the U.S. after a shooting at a high school in Portland in 2014. So, why is this so widely used? Is because Australia saw a 59% decline in gun homicide rates after the National Agreement on Firearms was passed, which is massive. If I just looked at that, I would think, yeah, that works. But then when you dig deeper, there's a massive problem. And that's that Australia had virtually no gun violence to begin with. The gun homicide rate was already extraordinarily low and continually decreased for 15 years prior to the massacre that initiated the gun control policy in the first place. And since these numbers were so low, the 59% decrease actually falls within the margin of error and therefore is statistically irrelevant. The Australian example doesn't even hold statistical merit to be a valid argument. And we've never had a national buyback program in the United States, but we have had an assault weapons ban that was signed by President Clinton and lasted for 10 years. It was from 1994 to 2004. And it forbid the sale of those scary-looking semi-automatic rifles and handguns and banned the sale of magazines with a capacity of more than 10 rounds. And guess what? It turned out that the ban had no measurable impact on the number of shootings or number of firearm deaths while the legislation was in effect. And this is after numerous independent studies. The huge failure of the ban was, of course, the obsession over AR-15s and similar styled rifles. Gun control advocates are focusing on a weapon that accounts for a minuscule percentage of gun crime. It's less than 6%, in fact. Mass shootings didn't stop during the ban either. And mind you, this is when Columbine happened. Even so, gun deaths kept declining even after the assault weapons ban expired. If the anti-Second Amendment crowd actually cared about gun violence, they wouldn't obsess over rifles and mass shootings to this extent. The leading cause of gun deaths, besides suicide, is black-on-black gang violence with illegal handguns. But we don't like to talk about that because it's not a white supremacist with a scary AR-15. Argument number 2. You do not have the right to own any gun you want. Nope. No. I do. I have the right to own a tank. I seriously have the right to own a tank. If our country actually upheld the Second Amendment to its fullest extent, I have as much of a right to own my 9mm M&P shield as I do a freaking tank, a grenade launcher, an M16, or what have you. The Second Amendment was fully intended to arm the people with military-grade weaponry, which is why in the time it was drafted, the people in fact owned military-grade weaponry. The founders weren't idiots. They didn't think technological advancement in weaponry would stop once they drafted the Bill of Rights. In fact, they were alive during extraordinary advancement in firearms. For example, the puckle gun, which is the early version of the Gatling gun, which is now what we consider a machine gun, was created pre-Revolutionary War. Believe it or not, the men who created the most important legal documents of human history were quite intelligent. They experienced innovation and knew it would continue well past their time. Just as the First Amendment applies to modes of communication such as radio, TV, internet, the Second Amendment also applies to AR-15s at the very least. Rooney's third argument: fewer guns means fewer gun crimes, period. Okay, I'll be fair. It does sound somewhat logical. If you take away weapons, then people can't kill each other. Well, unfortunately, taking away inanimate objects doesn't turn criminals and murderers into stand-up, law-abiding citizens. We can't simply look at gun crimes. We need to look at violent crime as a whole. Singling out a weapon doesn't make sense because then, by pure statistics, we would need to regulate or ban knives, hands, feet, and blunt objects, which kill more people than AR-15s and rifles in general. Gun control advocates love to draw a distinct line between guns and people dying. That's the point. The argument here is that by limiting a weapon, that the crime itself will be eliminated, which we all know isn't true. The crime will simply be replaced. Eliminating the tool doesn't eliminate the criminal. And we see this in the UK where all guns are banned. Now everyone's stabbing each other. And the stubborn fact is, there is absolutely no correlation between higher rates of gun ownership and higher rates of violent crime. Just as there is no evidence that gun control policies are associated with lower rates of violent crime or homicide. In the United States, violent crime has been on the decline for decades. According to the Brookings Institute, violent crime in 2011 was half of what it was in 1991 and continues to decrease. Meanwhile, gun ownership has continued to rise. We have well over 300 million firearms in this country. And if you look at a state-by-state analysis, gun control policy and gun homicides do not have an inverse relationship. One doesn't go up while the other goes down. New York City, LA, Chicago, these cities are among the strictest with gun control, yet have some of the highest homicide rates. This doesn't only pertain to the United States. Countries such as Israel and Switzerland have much higher rates of gun ownership than the US, but have fewer homicides and violent crimes than countries in Europe with strict gun control policies. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention our good-natured Canadian neighbors. Some of the provinces have higher homicide rates than U.S. states who are considered to be gun-friendly. Now, correlation does not automatically equal causation. I can safely say that the notion that gun control equals less deaths is not proven. For gun control advocates, the evidence is mixed at best. I'll give you that. In fact, the Crime Prevention Research Center notes that if any correlation had to be made, if you had to make one, it's that higher gun ownership correlates with lower homicide rates. Another common talking point at the expense of the Second Amendment is that the United States leads the world in mass shootings. The only so-called evidence that shows this is a defunct study by Adam Langford, whose methodology was considered so flawed and biased that even Langford himself would not reveal how he came up with his numbers. This led economists and statisticians from both sides of the aisle unable to support his conclusions. What unmanipulated statistics have found is that the United States actually ranks 11th in the world in mass shooting frequency and death rate. And in case you were wondering, Norway is number 1. Norway doesn't even allow citizens to get a permit for a firearm if for reasons of self-defense. That's the nation leading the world in mass shootings. However, all this gun control talk completely ignores one very important underlying fact. Regulating the Second Amendment rights of the people at all, to any extent, is unconstitutional. If you want Virginia-style legislation, you have to do one thing: repeal the Second Amendment. Good luck with that. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have background checks. I absolutely think we should. But we have to draw a line. And overstepping that line is overstepping the Constitution. Every amendment in the Constitution rides on the back of the Second Amendment. Without our right to bear arms, our first line of defense in keeping our liberty is non-existent. It's no surprise that the first step that regimes like those of Hitler, Lenin, and Castro took was disarming its citizens. The Second Amendment is as follows: a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This could not be more straightforward. It's brief, precise, and yet extraordinarily broad. And it was written this way by design. And well-regulated does not mean what we think of today. Well-regulated does not mean well-legislated. It meant that the people were well-equipped and sufficiently prepared, which inevitably meant that they needed weapons of the military. The Second Amendment was created to defend a people against a tyrannical government. Obviously, the people need weapons equivalent to the military to stand a fighting chance. Plus, you can't put regulated in the sense that we know it now and shall not be infringed in the same context of law if regulated did mean impose legislation, because they would void each other. The Second Amendment would just be one contradiction. It's painfully self-evident what the Second Amendment protects. The moment we start setting arbitrary context to the law, it renders our rights useless. This is true for any amendment. And I've said this in the past, and I'll say it again. Give the government an inch, and they'll take a mile. An infringement of any right sets a precedent to infringe on others. Make no mistake, regardless of the right, an infringement of the people is the expansion of the government. And Virginia is stepping into authoritarian territory, and that's what happens when you elect democratic socialists who have no respect for the Constitution or the liberty of the people. Those are my thoughts on the Virginia gun legislation. It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. If you like the podcast, please leave a 5-star review. I really appreciate it. It helps others find the show. If you have any critiques, question, feedback, if you want to help support the show, you can email me at contact@alyssaAhlgren.com. Everyone, I'll see you next week, and have a very Merry Christmas.